Welcome to Homer Bound, a podcast where a couple nerds read through and discuss Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. As usual, I am Wriste.
I am Llama.
Let's see, this is episode 5, right? Yeah, this is episode 5. It feels like so many more, but we're roughly a fifth of the way through, I suppose.
Yeah, we're getting into it. We're getting into the good stuff now. Not that there wasn't good stuff before, but we're certainly getting into some really meaty stuff now.
Well, it's weird because this part, like, this is a very... We'll be talking about Book 9 in this episode, and Book 9 is obviously a very significant one. But for me, the meatiness, like the real meatiness sort of comes in the last third. Like, it sort of becomes like a smear of violence from this point on, with
it's
like
a good
some
way of describing it. Smear of violence.
Which is not to say that there isn't anything particularly interesting. There's a lot of cool stuff that happens in these books, but
absolutely,
we have this sort of big thing happening, and then we get back to all the well, actually we sort of kick off the carnage, and it just goes for books.
Sustained gory violence.
And speaking of sustained gory violence, I guess this is a perfect place to drop the usual content warning. We'll be talking about sustained gory violence and other sustained atrocities, perhaps.
Maybe a little bit of hugging and kissing thrown in.
Yeah, some hugging and kissing. Not very much hugging and kissing in these particular
today.
episodes, but if you find yourself interested in the rest.
And as usual, we are both children in adult bodies, and we have potty mouths.
Yes. If there is a mature content warning that happens to show up on any of our episodes, just remember it's more of an immaturity warning. There's nothing mature about thinking bad words are funny, but here we are. Before we get into Book 9, and before we talk about our guests, or bring in our guest, rather, who's patiently waiting, really quickly, recap what we talked about last episode, Books 7 and 8, where it doesn't feel like too much happened. I feel like you can sort of summarize both of them in just a couple sentences. That's what I'll try to do. Book 7, Ajax duels with Hector, is pretty straightforward. Athena and, I believe, Apollo sort of elected to halt the fighting for a little bit so that Hector can duke it out with any of the Achaeans' greatest. And, of course, Ajax ended up being that greatest, and he kind of kicked Hector's ass, and nighttime saved him. And we can sort of scoot past that into Book 8, where the tides of battle turns. Tides of battle turn. There we go.
Oh, how the turns have tabled.
Yes, the turns do table. It's the kickoff to the smear of violence that I mentioned earlier. We get a whole book of just the Achaeans are sort of at a loss because we remember Book 2, where there was these hordes and hordes of Achaeans, and then like a couple pages of Trojans. It doesn't seem like the Trojans should have any chance, much less of a chance outside their walls, and I imagine the Achaeans don't think this as well, but here they are, sort of backed up against a makeshift facsimile of the walls of Troy, with their own sort of ramparts.
Between a rock and a hard place now.
If the ocean's a hard place, I suppose.
I would say the ocean is a hard place. Not many people would do very well surviving out on the ocean for great
That's true.
periods of time.
But yeah, the night fell at the end of Book 8. So again, night sort of saves whoever's getting run down. The Trojans are sort of waiting outside the Achaeans' ships, their ramparts with watchfires blazing. Agamemnon's freaking out. No one knows what to do. No one expected this. Zeus basically directly attacked them in the last book, which is not a great sign, especially for Agamemnon, because you had received a kindly written letter telling you, hey, Zeus has sort of, endorsed this whole trip, and now he's tabling the turns. So that's where we find ourselves. And this is a really important episode.
And I think
really important
this
book.
Is probably as good a time as any to introduce our lovely guest, who is joining us for Books 9 and 10 today, Joel Christensen. And hello, how are you today?
Good. How are you guys doing?
We're great. We're really happy to have you here.
I'm happy to be here. I think any day I get to talk about the Iliad's a good day.
Because as I said, this is a really important book, and I don't know if me and Llama can do this alone. We need additional help. And
you were just talking about the smear of violence, right? That takes up a lot of what happens after Book 9. What really makes Book 9 exceptional is the proportion of conversation, right? This is a book that leads to all action, but is about 90% conversation. And it includes like just moments that people have argued about for a few thousand years, about like what's the quality of Achilles' character, what's he actually saying, how does it reflect on the plot. So there are many people who think that like the entire like meaning of the Iliad hinges on how you interpret Book 9. So not to put too much pressure on us right now, but everybody who listens to this and how they understand the Iliad for all time will hinge on the questions we ask today.
No pressure
you're here to bring to the fore those thousands of years of debate, right? That's why you're here, and we're here to sort of gawk or what have you.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, really quickly, just telling a little bit about who you are and why we have you here today.
Sure. So again, my name's Joel Christensen. I'm a professor of classical studies at Brandeis University. But that's not why you have me here. You have me here because I talk a lot about the Iliad. I've written a bit about it. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. So I started working on Homer when I was an undergraduate back in the 90s. And I wrote my dissertation on the Iliad. Really inspired by moving to New York City right before September 11th, and sort of living there during the protests, the anti-terror war and that nonsense, and just sort of spending years living alongside the Iliad. So I've written a couple books about Homer. This moment in Book 9 is something that I've gone back to over the years, really rethinking from many different perspectives, and it's something that really repays sort of revisiting as you sort of look at the world differently. So I've been teaching, writing, thinking about Homer for at least 2 decades, and you know, I screw around a lot online. I write things here and there. I make some noise and see what happens, and I love talking to people who are excited about Homer. So I don't think that qualifies me to be here, but I hope that that's a special plus.
You're probably more qualified to be here than either of us, so
I would go ahead and say you're definitely more qualified to be here than either of us.
I'm pretty smart. I mean, I don't know what you say.
You would like to think that, wouldn't you?
No, but the truth is, I mean, oftentimes people knowing too much about it can actually keep them from seeing it anew, right? And you get sort of in ruts, and so, you know, I think that Book 9, because it is based in conversation and different perspectives and really sort of standing on the sort of hinge of decisions, really repays sort of groups working together to bring different perspectives on it. So every time I talk about it with people, I learn something new. So I think what the questions you have will probably make me realize things I didn't realize before. And then I'll probably bring up things that are controversies, and you'll be like, well, that's nonsense. Why do people care about that? Right.
Oh, I'm so excited for that because I love those kinds of questions. Like, there are so many things that you think are nonsense, but there's so many ways that you can read into them and find meaning from them, you know?
There's a Roman poet and philosopher named Seneca the Younger who complains that the sickness of the Greeks is caring about how many oars there were on Odysseus's ship, or whether or not Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, when they should be more concerned with the pain in their life than whatever Odysseus suffered. So I try to use those types of comments as sort of centering, like, all right, oars on Odysseus' ship, it doesn't matter, but how many were there?
And it's interesting that you say, like, returning to these books time and time again sort of yields new things. I got to experience that sort of firsthand. I've been thinking about this episode for at least a couple of weeks, and over the last couple of days, I've just read Book 9 over and over again. And every time I think I've got a hold of what's going on, I have more questions. each visit, it's familiar, but it's like someone's rearranged the furniture a little bit, and I'm not quite sure where everything's supposed to go.
Well, it's like, do you guys know, and it's probably getting a few years on, but I think 2000 or so, the movie Memento came out, which is about a guy who couldn't form new short-term memories. And there's that scene where, like, he comes to and he's, like, looking at a bottle of liquor, and he says, "I don't feel drunk." And I feel that that's often the reaction you should have with Homer, right? You're, like, looking at words, you're like, wait a minute. Does that make sense? And you just gotta shake it off and be like, wait, it's not that there's something wrong with the poem. Like, I gotta get straight up here, right?
I honestly, that just blew my mind a little bit.
But here's the thing.
So, like, that's very on point. You know, it is very much that kind of syndrome of, like, I don't remember being drunk. I don't remember how we got here.
Yeah, right. But if I could set a baseline, so so part of the way I approach Homer, that will help sort of frame all the crazy things I say, is that for me, the Iliad and the Odyssey come out of oral traditions that develop alongside audience interest and oral composition. And it's a dynamic situation where you want to appeal to the broadest audience possible without disambiguating so much that you alienate too many people, right? So it contains all this delicious stuff, but you can't always quite pin what that flavor is. Another way I describe it is it's like an orchestra being played in multiple rooms by musicians who can't hear each other, right? And if you go from room to room, you hear a different melody line, you hear a different portion, and you're like, oh, I think I got it. And then you go to the other room and you listen and you're like, oh, I have it now, but you haven't put it all together. And that's how complex reading the Iliad and the Odyssey is. Like, you're always a few steps behind. And where I think people, like, go astray is assuming that they have a picture of the whole, right? Instead of sort of approaching the text with the humility, right? Which is usually the way I go, except sometimes I'll say ridiculous things just to see what happens.
I'm glad this feeling of lostness or confusion is ubiquitous, because I've read the Iliad quite a few times, and I'm still unsure about plenty of things. So
again, I love the term you just used there, the lostness, right? Another way I describe it, I'm sorry I'm keeping us from even getting to book 9, is it produces in audiences the same effect that Socratic dialogues do. So I don't know if you guys have talked about Plato before in the podcast.
We haven't had occasion to, no.
Well, here's what's important.
I might have mentioned it.
Right. So Socrates, you might have heard of him, goes around asking people questions, right? And people think, oh, you're supposed to get answers from that, but you're not. You're supposed to learn how to ask questions. So at the end of early Platonic dialogue, Socrates gets to a point where he's like, oh, we still don't know what friendship is. I guess we should start over. And that's that's my Socrates robot voice. That's called a moment of aporia in Greek. Aporia means pathlessness. It means you've reached an impasse and you're fucked, right? And the only thing you can do that's reasonable is to go back to the beginning and do it all again and hope that you make some adjustments and end up somewhere else. And I actually think that the Iliad and the Odyssey function in that way at a huge level, right? You're constantly being drawn back into it and like being spit out again, right? And then you got to go back in and be like, oh, what did I do wrong? Let's try that again. So I love that you said the lostness, right? The pathlessness. I think it's the point, is that you're supposed to be put in a moment of discomfort. You're supposed to question things and go back. And to tie that into book 9, and so this might get a little too meta, but I think that what Achilles is doing in book 9 is suffering the same sort of cognitive dissonance that we experience as audience members, trying to make sense of a super messed up world and values we don't know if we believe in, and trying to figure out what we should do with our lives. And so I think that there's this sort of analogy between understanding the Iliad and understanding how Achilles is understanding the world in book 9 that helps us move one step closer to not being totally screwed when we get to the end of the poem.
I think I know what you're talking about when you say that Achilles is wrestling with this sort of thing, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about it in more detail.
I don't think you could have put it better, because that's the exact kind of thing that I was thinking when I was reading this book, is like, the cognitive dissonance is so huge on all sides, really. It's not just Achilles, but it's kind of everyone trying to figure out where they are now.
And the essential thing is that it's like anything where you go and you're like, I have my list of social cues, I have my list of social rules and expectations, and I get in a situation and they all break down. I'm like, wait, is this, I don't have rules for this. I don't know what to do. All right. But we can talk about that. Anyway, how do you want to start with book 9?
I, for one, would like to start, not literally at the very start, but with Agamemnon. In fact, me and Llama have had a slight disagreement on how to view Agamemnon. I think that Agamemnon gets a really bad rep, and it's unfortunate because Achilles doesn't.
I take a less charitable view of Agamemnon. I think there's a lot of character flaws that I think are intended to be there.
It's not so much that I view him charitably. It's that I think there's a specific underlying tragedy about his character that makes it very difficult to box him into, at least mainly in like the movie Troy, where Agamemnon's this sort of terrible asshole of a king, and it doesn't really give him anything more than that. I think there's a lot behind that. I think it's often failed to be observed, and it hovers over everything that Agamemnon does.
So, I think that you're both right. Right. So no.
This is what I said before.
All right. So yeah. I both agree that Agamemnon is underestimated and that he's a bit of a cad. Right. So one of the things. So you did book 2 already, but I'm going to go back there. Right. Agamemnon starts book 2. He says I'm going to test people. It turns out badly. But what people don't follow is that he says to his small council, "I'm going to test the people. They're going to run away. You guys stop them." He knows that his speech is going to be terrible. He knows that they're going to run away. He plans it. And at the end of book 2, he's got everybody rallied in the same cause. All right. Book 2 is a net win for Agamemnon. All right. So he's not incompetent, but
no,
is not a good person.
Yeah, I think like my feeling on the matter is less that he's incompetent, just more that like he seems to me to be almost like emotionally unregulated and kind of just weird to be around. I get the feel.
Are we then going to claim that Achilles is emotionally stable?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. I think everyone in these books
in a way, Achilles is emotionally stable. He's very stably a certain way, which is mad.
The feeling that I get is that like people are uncomfortable around Agamemnon and find him to be kind of unpredictable and not reliable. And I
actually see it the opposite way. Agamemnon, how much he relies on Nestor is crazy. It's one of those things where, if Nestor were a terrible person, then Agamemnon would be a terrible king. But it turns out Nestor does have a lot of good advice. And Agamemnon, with the exception of, book 1, he does listen to him. He does listen to good advice, even if he sort of relies on that advice a lot. I think that he's generally open to, and we'll see it here in book 9, where Agamemnon, in a sort of sad echo of his original tests in book 2, where he tells his men to cut and run, but this time they're like, "What? No, you can't. We can't do that." So
let's get the beginning of book 9 then and repeat some of what happens in book 2, but with the we're screwed, we're all gonna die, let's go home right now. But I've had a friend named Benjamin Sammons tell me that we're reading it wrong, that it's another performance and Agamemnon is trying to get somebody to push back against him so somebody else can rally the troops rather than him. I don't really buy that. I think Agamemnon is still like, we're screwed, let's go home. But what it does emphasize that's really important is that the Achaeans as a group succeed because they don't actually just rely on Agamemnon, right? They've got like super cool people like Diomedes, right, who's always there to help out, right? And then wise old people like Nestor, who talks a little too much, to knit everything together when Agamemnon screws up. And so one of my arguments usually is for this scene that it's a powerful testament to how important it is to not have monarchy, to not rely on one person alone, and that this is actually, for the ancient audience, a testament to the importance of at least an oligarchic arrangement, right, where multiple voices are involved in governance. Right, so that may seem a far way off from the fun of dishing on Agamemnon, but it really shows like there's a real distinction, because in Troy you don't get that, right?
No,
Priam makes the final call, especially in, I think it was it with book 7, where he's just like, yeah, we're not gonna give up Helen, we're just gonna like send this pile of stuff and have that be our offering.
And that's good, right?
Despite what Antenor says, which is, really good advice.
Yeah, and 3 times after this book, you guys will talk about it, Polydamas gives good advice to Hector, and Hector's like, I don't want to do that. You're dumb.
Poor Polydamas.
Yeah, right? So I really think, so this scene, it's a repeat for Agamemnon, but it allows Diomedes to come out and be like, no, I'm going to take Troy alone with my friend Sthenelus.
Which in itself is a little bit ridiculous, which Nestor, I think...
But wait, is it? They claim in book 4 that they took Thebes without a whole bunch of people. I mean, it is ridiculous, right?
It's at least a little ridiculous.
But then, Nestor, you're right. Nestor comes in. But he comes into a moment. So I think part of the thing that sort of complicates what my friend Ben says about this moment is that Nestor comes in and he's like, look, Diomedes, sure, you're cool, right? But then he says this stuff, right? He says, brotherless, fatherless, cityless is the man who longs for civil conflict, right? Nestor resets everything. Because what happens at the beginning of book 9 is almost a replay of books 1 and 2 together, where you have this threat of the entire coalition falling apart. And Nestor's like, that's swell, but we're not going to do that, right? We're all going to chill out. We're going to meet in a council and where we talk about serious stuff, and y'all, the rest of you, are going to go think about how cool Diomedes is and do whatever it is you do when you're not around, right? And so this is a real moment where, again, I'm glad that you started out by talking about how the Trojans have they powered up, they've slept outside in the field for the first time in 10 years, and the Greeks are freaked out. They're like, we're screwed, let's go get Achilles back, right? And that's what Nestor does, right? He goes, he's like, hey, Agamemnon, you're cool and shit, but we need Achilles, you made a mistake, tell him sorry, give him some stuff, let's get this train back on the tracks.
I do really want to highlight, before we move on to the embassy part of the embassy, people talk about how clever Odysseus is, and Odysseus is very clever, especially in the Odyssey. We get to see some of that, but Nestor is a master of getting things done with just his words. It happens in book 8 where he has to convince Diomedes to back down by convincing him that his courage wouldn't be questioned if he backs down. And in this particular passage, I think a normal lesser person would be tempted when Agamemnon says, let's cut and run. They might say, no, don't cut and run, or do what Diomedes did, which is, cut and run, go for it, you chicken. But Nestor, he doesn't even address it. He just says, listen, just set out an evening meal, do your duty as a king. He reminds Agamemnon that he is a king, and he reminds him of his duties, which sort of just gets to the issue right at the start. Like, Agamemnon can't run because he did lead everyone here. And it's such a good response when he says to Diomedes, you don't press on and reach a useful end. I think this is Nestor trying to reach the actual useful end, which is getting everyone to settle down.
Yeah, no, I think he refocuses everything there, and it is, I think, Nestor's strongest moment in the epic. Everyone listens to him. It doesn't actually end up turning out the way he wants, but it gets pretty close, and we can get there at the end of 9. But Agamemnon listens to him, almost takes all of his advice with a little bit of a problem, right? And then it just moves on.
Yes.
Right? And so the problem, of course, is that Nestor says, look, you should just apologize, send the stuff. And then, Agamemnon's speech is, I'll send him the stuff, but he's got to admit that I'm I'm better.
Yeah, the little tantrum that he throws at the end it feels so bad because, on multiple occasions, I think in like book 2 and here in book 9, he's at least relented to the fact that he made some poor decisions. How he doles out that responsibility, like whether it's between him and the gods, I don't know. But he's at least ready to like say it, and like, okay, you're on the right path. And then he, as I said, he lists all that stuff out, and then he just says, "I'm the greater man. Like, I'm so much better than him." And it's like, that's the wrong attitude to have. You're so close.
Because he's a spoiled man-child.
Well, but the question is, what would his motivation be in saying that?
Yeah.
And it's to forestall the same thing from happening again. And, it does show, I think, a sort of a weakness of character, that, he can't completely give it up. But let's not be too, forgiving of Achilles, right? I mean, the man went to Zeus, or went to his mother to ask Zeus to have his own people killed.
Yes, that hangs over this whole conversation for, the whole rest of the book for me. It hangs over the entire Iliad for me, really. I think people forget that he asked for this specifically.
He does. He's not, and, Patroclus dies, which is terrible, but Achilles asked for it. And that's the thing, I mean, he's kind of a traitor. So I think, this is one of those things where, part of the tradition of the Iliad is people arguing Agamemnon versus Achilles, right? And in the Republic, Plato suggests that you shouldn't even read the Iliad because then people would know that people would believe it's possible to go against your commander. So he actually has Socrates criticize Achilles because he's like, he is being insubordinate, right? You can't have this.
I just find them overall to both be so flawed. They both have these, and they're different flaws. They both internalize their own, histories in a different way, but they both just have these grudges that they hold on to, and these almost kind of base instincts that they won't let go of no matter what. And it comes to a head with each other and inspires this whole insane conflict.
Yeah, there's I'm forgetting the name of the book, but the Interviews with Hideous Men or something like that, right? It's short vignettes of imaginary interviews with terrible people, and that's kind of what the Iliad is, right? Yeah.
They both belong in there, as far as I'm concerned.
The one thing that I guess allows me to give Agamemnon what I think most people would give to Achilles is that they are terrible people. I suspect that pretty much everyone in the Iliad, with the exception of, I don't know, maybe Hector, who knows, is not super great. But their flaws are magnified by their positions. Achilles has tons of sway over. If he was just some soldier like Thersites, then who cares? If Agamemnon were just some schmuck, his weaknesses of character wouldn't matter so much. But Agamemnon has sort of, by birth or by what circumstance, I'm not totally sure what circumstances led him to be here, but whenever I see Agamemnon, I see that feeling that we all get when we evaluate where we are and we're like, how did I get here and what am I doing? And I feel that with Agamemnon at every point, which is why I maybe identify with him just a little bit, because we do ask ourselves this question, how did we get here? And as Diomedes points out, he's been given sort of gifts by half measures. Zeus has given him this great responsibility, but he also has not given him courage. Although I think that Diomedes is a little too focused on courage, because I think the actual thing that Agamemnon is missing is wisdom. And so he's kind of been set up to fail. He's been set up to fail here quite literally, but...
Right, but he's not helping his own case. And in fact, throughout the books, I feel like he directly goes out of his way to not help his own case.
Well, I think he tries pretty hard in this one, right?
In this one, he does try.
He does. I mean, he doesn't fuck it up completely.
No.
Somehow.
He gives Nestor what he asked for, which is he has a big bunch of gifts, and then he adds that little bit at the end. Let him say that I'm better. And everyone's like, oh, that's cringy.
Which Odysseus wisely leaves out.
He leaves out, right? And like, maybe he'd been drinking too much at that point in the middle of the day. It's hot. I don't know. But it's also like, he's trying to save face, right? One of the things that I always tell people about when they're reading the Iliad and thinking about the speeches is who are the audiences in the poem, right? So when we're reading Agamemnon's speech to that council, like, we are the audience. But he's not talking to us. He's talking to the other chieftains there who may run afoul of him, who may think, oh, I can just do whatever I want. I don't have to listen to these commands. I can just like withdraw my labor and get a greater share of the spoils,
And Agamemnon can't let Achilles one-up him on that, because he has to maintain that, right? He's Lord of Men Agamemnon. He's the greatest king.
What happens next is one of the reasons that Achilles says no, is that Agamemnon offers all this stuff, but the stuff makes him subordinate to Agamemnon again. It makes him his son-in-law, right? And it's also that thing, like if someone gives you a gift that's far nicer than they should, right? It's awkward, right? Are you indebted to them? Do you owe them another gift?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean if someone's like giving you too much? So there's this sort of like rhetoric of generosity, right? This sort of aggressive gift giving, right? So I just said, well, Agamemnon did everything, but he might have gone too far. He might have been like, look, I'm such a baller. I can give him 7 cities, all these women. I don't care. Just tell him, make him promise that I'm better than him.
In fact, he failed to give Achilles the one thing that might have swayed him, which is like a personal visit, a personal apology, or a personal word of any kind. I don't know if we can attribute this failure to Nestor or to Agamemnon. I feel like Agamemnon probably should have gone himself.
Yeah, but that would have made him... So look, maybe we can answer some of that with the next thing I'm bringing up. So I know, Llama, you said before you wanted some of the ridiculous, obscure discussions people get in. Have you heard about the duels of Iliad 9?
I have not heard about the duels of Iliad 9.
So this is an obscure thing that only Homers care about, but they care about it a lot. So you know how languages have singular and plural? So right, human and humans. Well, Indo-European languages have another number, which is the dual. And it tends to be used for like 2 eyes, 2 people, 2 hands, twins working in concert. And so after the embassy leaves Agamemnon, it switches to duels, right? So it uses a form that's typically used to describe 2 heralds going to see somebody else, like another person, to give a message. And so for years, people have argued about this scene because you've got 2 heralds plus 3 people going to the assembly, and they're like, holy shit, is this 1, the wrong lines for this passage, or 2, is it describing 2 groups when it should only be describing 2 people, or 3, is this really about that they've added a 3rd person to the embassy and they didn't change the formulaic language? And so it starts at line 182 in the Greek, and like if you read the Lattimore or something like that, it'll be the same. But it's a whole passage where it's just like using this formulaic language that really hasn't been used since they sent an embassy to Chryses in Book 1 to apologize to him. So there's lots of debate about what this means. Like lots of people are like, oh, this is a screw up. Other people are like, oh, it's just formulaic language being used in a formulaic situation. Some people think that it's, Greg Nodge, who's a Homerist, argues that Achilles hates Odysseus so much that his presence in the embassy is being suppressed here with the use of the duel. But I think that probably what's happening here is that embassies like this, marked by a duel, is made for when you're sending representatives to an enemy or someone from a different crew, right, from a different nation. So I think that here this is actually there to unsettle us on purpose, right? To make us realize that something weird is going on and that the embassy isn't the normal series of events. So that's one of those how many oars does Odysseus have question. But there, lots of ink has been spilled on what these dual forms mean in Book 9.
Obviously, I don't have the context or knowledge to really say too much about that, especially since, at least in our translation, I don't know if can I even manifest in English translation?
Actually, so our words both and two in English have inside that long O sound, the same sound that the dual has in Greek. So it's being reflected there, but yeah, it's pretty hard to do in a language that doesn't have it, right?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff. All right, so the embassy itself, right? So we get there.
Well, actually, your comment on I guess two people, or referring to two people, makes me think of, I guess, the first thing that stands out to me in the embassy, which I'd like to ask you. It seems as though there's some confusion as to who is leading this embassy. Is there not? Nestor says, Phoenix leads the way, but then a few lines later it says Odysseus leads the way. And when they're seated, when Achilles greets them, he brings them in. We get the food scene, and Ajax gives Phoenix the signal, whatever that is. Odysseus notes it, and then
he starts talking.
He breaks in, right?
Yeah.
So so people run a whole range of interpretations of what happens here, right? Some people are like, well, this is evidence of different layers in the composition of the text, right? So Odysseus was added in later. And again, I feel like that's sort of lazy reading. What's probably going on here is that Odysseus is smarter, one. And two, we have a series of people speaking from increasing levels of proximity to Achilles, right? And each one gets a different outcome, right? Odysseus is the representative, the official representative. He gets the details out, and Achilles freaks out at him, right? And says at the end, and we can go back to the details, but he says at the end, I'm going home, right? Screw you guys. Right? And he starts it out with that famous saying, I hate like the gates of hell, the man who says one thing and hides another in his heart. Yeah. And you don't know who he's talking about.
Very impassioned.
Right? But then Phoenix talks, right? And gives a long speech and is emotionally charged. And at the end, Achilles is like, oh, you stay here, Phoenix. You stay here with me, and we'll talk about leaving in the morning.
We'll think about it. He's altered the deal.
But then, it sets up Ajax at the end. So Ajax doesn't even look at Achilles. He talks to the other guys.
It's really passive aggressive.
No, it's so smart because Achilles cares about people. You just can't tell because he's a jerk, right? No, but Ajax is like, look, this guy's a jerk. He doesn't listen. Even someone whose kin is killed will take a blood price for the murder. Let's just go. He's not going to listen. And so this is like, Ajax might just be Achilles' best friend apart from Patroclus, right? It's his cousin, it's close. We see in Greek art all these images of Ajax and Achilles playing a board game together. And so this is this is harmful. So again, we could take, to go way back to the beginning, your first question, what does it mean that it's orchestrated this way? Does it mean we have different textual layers? Maybe.
Well, my question is more surface level. It's like, it seems to me that Odysseus knows he's smart, and of course you would choose Odysseus for a mission like this. But I almost read this as like a weird failure of Odysseus, because he's the only one who doesn't get Achilles to give any ground.
But he gets the worst information out there, right? So let's say you and I have to tell Llama some pretty bad news, but at the end we don't want her to murder us, right? So how are we going to handle it?
There.
Yeah, we're not going to start out with like, look, we've got some ice cream and puppies coming. That's cool. We can all hang out. Oh, by the way, we hate everything about you, right? I mean, you flip it around. You're like, here's some terrible news. Ice cream and puppies. I mean, it's really about like starting out like, here's the pain. And Odysseus knows that I think that Agamemnon's offer is going to piss him off.
Yeah, the way I saw it is that Odysseus is the one ripping the Band-Aid off. He's going in there and saying, let's get the hard part over with. Let's get the bad news out of the way. And then we can try and work on this and find a middle ground, which doesn't end up happening, but he tries.
But the thing is, it does.
They do find a middle ground.
Look.
It's a weird middle ground. It's not great.
But that's the thing about compromise, right? Isn't good compromise something where nobody walks away happy?
Yeah, that's true.
So we start out by Achilles saying, I'm going home, right? Screw you all. And then at the end, he's like, I'm not going home until somebody, or at all. I'm going to stay here until someone tries to burn my ship, right? Which again, I mean, it's a super jerky move. But he stays, and it sets things up for later. So they have preserved the possibility for later action, right? And if you're already thinking Odysseus, or if you're already thinking Achilles is a lost cause, right? He's not helping. It's worse for you if his ships leave in the morning. That destroys morale, right? So there's that, right? And there's also sort of like the drama of how Achilles develops as a thinker, where he is as a space. So I think oftentimes when people read this, they don't see what Achilles is doing beforehand. When the embassy comes, he's sitting there playing a lyre, right? And he's singing in Greek, the Kleia Andron, right? Which is the famous stories of men. Right? He's singing, I think, all the stories of myths that he's learned before, right? Of the story, trying to figure out what to do, realizing that he doesn't have a paradigm. He has no guide for action. As we talked about at the beginning, Wriste, Achilles and friends are adrift in a sea of options they don't understand. Right, they're outside of their normal course of actions, and he's there. He's playing, and Patroclus is there, waiting for him to stop singing. And Odysseus comes, and then
that's something I would like to zoom in on just a little bit, because Patroclus, he hasn't had any speaking roles yet. He's shown up, and he's like done stuff. It seemed like a weird line to put in there, like to explicitly say that Patroclus is. We're using the Fagles version, the Fagles translation. It says like he's sitting alone, waiting for Achilles to finish his song. It doesn't say anything about like how he feels about it. He's just kind of there. To me, it seems like the way I read Patroclus's relationship with Achilles is that it's probably a little strained, because Achilles is being an asshole, and Patroclus is ready with this information, especially in, it's like book 11 or book 13 or something like that. When he talks to Nestor, like the first thing out of his mouth is, yeah, Achilles is impossible. That guy's crazy. And in book 16, he just says it right to his face. So Patroclus has been stewing on this as well. And like, he's not sitting with his friend, he's sitting across from him. They sleep across from each other at the end of the book, but I guess this image sort of makes it seems like Achilles is kind of enjoying himself, and Patroclus is contemplating.
Yeah, I completely believe that. I mean, so I'm looking at the Greek on my other screen here, and it's Achilles was delighting his heart, right, with the lyre. He sang the stories of famous men, and Patroclus sat there alone in silence, right? And silence is a menacing thing in the Iliad, right? If you look at where people are silent, it's usually like in surprise or shock or despair, right?
Or if you're Ares.
Yeah, this is not an epic where people have problems coming up with things to say, right? So I think your reading of Patroclus is really good there, right? And then Achilles, he just spouts off on Odysseus / Agamemnon / everything, and his speech. So if we take his 3 speeches, the first one is something that has given people fits for a long time, because they're like, well, what's he saying and why is he saying it? There's an entire tradition of is Achilles breaking with tradition here? Is he saying things that can't be said with traditional language, right? There's this whole debate about like how much he sort of breaks with tradition. And I'm less concerned with that, and sort of what's the content of what he's saying. And what he's saying is he says a couple things. He's like, look, one, I don't need Agamemnon stuff because I'm already rich, right? 1.
Yeah, my dad can get me whatever I want.
2, let's stop and think about this glory thing for a minute, right? Because if the man who does nothing and the man who does a lot gets the same when they die, and they all die, like, what's all this for, right? And so he's really, I mean, like, this is a central debate. And I think people often they try to answer this question before they get to the end of the poem, right? We roughly know what happens at the end of the poem, but what it comes down to is he's asking a question: what's worth fighting for, right? What's worth risking your life for? And he's missed it, right? He misses the answer here, because the answer is the people you care about.
He gets really close when he says, like, he took away Bracius, and like he was really close to saying it's like people I love, but then he went back to like honor, and it's like he was so close, he missed it just by a hair. So many characters are like this.
I know, but people talk about like this is an existential moment, right? They talk about it being childish, and I think everyone's right? Because Achilles here, think about this. It's like, that string of moments that happen from when you're like somewhere in your adolescence to early 20s where you're like, wait, everything I've been taught is bullshit, but yet there's no other option. I'm already locked into the system. There's nothing else for me to do, right? Achilles is that moment where he's like, everything here is terrible. There's no other option. This is all nonsense. So why should I even do it anymore, right? And he's coming at it from that point where like he's in a position of privilege where he can say that. Right? Whereas a physical power, he has the material resources, and he's asking those questions that I think are really familiar if you just really listen to them.
It's a weird experience reading the Iliad for the first time. It's a fairly distant, foggy memory for me at this point. But what got me in the room was reading what Achilles was saying. I was like, oh wait, like there's definitely more going on here, and him saying something that sounds so foreign, especially off the back of like Diomedes, who's just all about, courage and glory. We're hearing Achilles say sort of the opposite. And it was very striking because I wasn't sure how to view Achilles past then. Because up until then, he was sort of like an immature kind of guy, just yelling and being very petty toward his friends and countrymen.
Yeah. No, and I think that you can see how this isn't really met. People don't get it in the text, right? Like, so when Phoenix responds, like in his long response, he gives a couple. He's like, "Oh, I remember when you were young and puking on me. Don't you remember these stories we've talked about? And let me tell you this long story about Meleager, how he sat out of the fight, but he eventually went in the end and he didn't get any stuff. And then he's like, Achilles, you don't want to be like that." And I think everybody misses that Achilles actually listens to that story. He's like, wait, I do want to be like that. I want to fight and kill, but I don't care about the stuff. So maybe I'll hold out a while longer, right? So Phoenix gives this impassioned, really lengthy speech, one of the longest in the Iliad. And at the end, he just doesn't get it.
The impression that I got from that speech was almost exactly what you just said, in the sense of like Phoenix goes through this whole diatribe about bringing up Achilles and all of these things, and the entire time I'm sitting there thinking like, why are you telling this to a guy in the position that he's in right now? This is exactly what he wants to do. This is exactly what his base interest is right now.
And I think that it's precisely the point, is that speech functions to highlight the difference, the distance between where Achilles is and where people are around him, right? They just don't get it. Right? But it does enough, right? So that pulls on the heartstrings enough. It gets Achilles to move back enough in two ways. One, he thinks, oh wait, I could stay and still fight, but it won't obligate me with the stuff, right? So if you're saying, look, a system of reward, a social system is nonsense and unfair, and I don't want part of it, right? If you're saying that, but then you're like, but give me the stuff anyway, like you're back in the system. Right? So if Achilles takes the goods, he can't say the system is nonsense, right? But listening to Phoenix's story, he can say, all right, wait, I could stay around and still fight and save some face, but I don't have to take the stuff, right? And to fast forward to when you guys get to book 19, that's what he tries to do. He tries to come up and say, oh, I want to fight. And then Odysseus is say, no, really, you chill out, take the stuff first. And he's like, no, let's fight. And Odysseus is like, let's have a meal and take the stuff. And he's like, fine, I'll do it, right? Eventually, he comes around.
He's very impatient.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of question of like, how do you appeal to someone with a system that you're using when they don't want to buy into that system? He has no interest of buying into it, and they keep trying to appeal to him through that system, and he's just like, why am I supposed to care about this?
But that's where we get to like that moment with Ajax's speech, where I think he reads Achilles the best. Like Achilles, you cannot appeal to Achilles rationally. You cannot appeal to him and be like, look, here's a system of exchange. You won't get to engage in it, right? Instead, it's like, let's just ignore him. He's got no heart. He doesn't care about us.
It's possible that Phoenix has sort of, I guess, failed to read Odysseus's move correctly, where he's sort of Phoenix, as I said, he brings up the prospect of like reward and honor and stuff like that, which Achilles has already made it fairly clear doesn't really matter to him. He should have, if he was going to tell the Meleager story, he should have led with it, perhaps, but then ended with what we know actually gets to Achilles, especially from book 24, which is bringing up like his relationships, like his relationship with him as sort of a father figure. That would have, if he had ended on that being the last thing that Achilles said, that might have landed a little bit better.
Well, and you know what's interesting though is that to dwell on the Meleager story for a minute is that the Meleager story Phoenix tells isn't like any other Meleager story that people know, right? It's a really old.
I don't know anything about Meleager.
So Meleager's just like he's a big hero from Caledon, right? There's a terrible boar who comes up, and he basically goes on the hero bulletin board and says, "Hey everybody, come and help me kill a boar." Everybody comes who's anybody at the time. Right, it's like Voyage of the Argo or Seven Against Thebes, like all the big heroes go. But one of the people who comes is Atalanta, right, who's a woman, right, and Meleager kind of has a thing for her, and he lets her join, and she actually is the first one to wound the boar, and he gives the boar's hide to her, and it turns into like a giant war with his uncles about the honor over the killing of the boar. And so the story, though, that's beyond that isn't about the war with his uncles. One of the main stories is that Meleager is like Achilles in that he's got a special relationship with mortality, but it's even better. So there's a story that when his mother Althea was giving birth to him, goddess showed up, the fate showed up and pointed at a log on fire and said, when that log burns out, your son will die. Right? And she rescues the log from the fire, she puts out the fire, she puts it in a chest under the bed and leaves it there. Until years later, when he's getting in a fight with her brother, she gets mad, takes it out, throws it on a fire. And he dies. So it's like he fades away. I don't know if you guys remember the movie Back to the Future, but you know, Michael J. Keaton is like fading away in the picture as it's going and is like disappearing. That's kind of like what happens to Meleager. And we hear about this. There's a poem by a poet named Achilles, who's from like the 5th century, 6th century BCE, who has the story of Meleager in the underworld telling his story to Heracles. Anyway, the whole point is that Meleager is a big superhero, right? Who is a story about accepting your mortality, right? So this shows in part the cleverness of Homer. Like you expect, all right, if we're talking about Achilles and Meleager, maybe we're talking about brevity of life. But no, we're actually talking about division of spoils and not being angry and fighting until, you know what, you're going to die anyway, so it doesn't matter, right? So it's a total mind fuck of what's going on here. And I think what we as an external audience are supposed to be doing is waiting for the punchline and then going, wait, Phoenix doesn't get it. Did we get it? So again, it's another moment of aporia, right? That sort of lostness you talked about earlier. It's weird. And it leaves us in a moment. I think that Achilles is there too, maybe expecting more, right? At the beginning of the speech, he's like, you know, he's not angry at Phoenix. He's just like, Phoenix, what?
Yeah, he just kind of has this moment of just like, why are you telling me this? Like, I get that you're trying to make a point here, but what are you actually trying to get me to agree to here? You know, why are you telling me this, man? Because you know it's not really hitting home with me.
Phoenix is no Nestor.
Yeah, he's not. He wants to be, right? And he's only...
Everyone wants to be Nestor.
But it just shows, you know, this again, like what Achilles cares about is Phoenix. He doesn't actually at the end care what Phoenix said. Like he has a close relationship with him.
Which is why Ajax's short little thing at the end seemed to get him to budge the most.
It's the most effective because it hurts his feelings. Like if you look what he says, so I'm trying to draw it up in the English and not the Greek. And it hurts his feelings, you know? And so his response to him is, hey, wait a minute, right? He's like, look, you're speaking on my own mind here. Like, I'm thinking this too, but look, I'm going to make it clear to you. And that's when he clears his plan. Like, I'm going to stay here until Hector brings a fire here. All right? And then again, to get to the end of the book, like they go back and Odysseus only reports the earlier point.
Yeah, I noticed that. That was an interesting, weird choice by Odysseus.
Well, so I mean, what do you make of that?
I think it's Odysseus kind of knowing what people need to hear and what people don't need to hear. I think it's a really selective way of delivering this news, but in a way to kind of almost couch it in a softer.
Well, also, like, look,
You know?
look there's something really deeply petty about Achilles' final choice. It's like, I'm going to stay here until your ships are burned. I'll make sure mine don't. Right? And Odysseus is like, well, that's a non-starter. So instead he goes back, he's like, well, he says he's threatening to go home and to tell others to do it.
Well, Odysseus, it seems like he's doing the same thing that he did on the way there, which was leave out the bad stuff, or like the worst stuff, like, Agamemnon's little tantrum at the end. And then he comes back and sort of kind of does the same thing. I don't even know if Achilles meant that as a real slight. I don't know if Achilles has like no ability to empathize with other people, or to see, maybe not empathize with other people, but to see the outcomes of his actions in a capacity beyond himself.
Yeah, he's not very good at anticipating the consequences of his actions at all.
In fact, there is one comparison I want to draw, which I imagine a good number of people would probably dislike, but everyone's most beloved prince, Paris, he also seems to be like this. And Achilles, at least at the start of the embassy, makes a very Paris move. When Paris takes, when Paris in book 3, he's finished his duel with Menelaus, and he's up in his room, and the first thing he wants to do is have sex with Helen, which is in really poor taste because she's the person everyone's fighting over, and he's just sort of enjoying her at his leisure. And Achilles is kind of doing the same sort of thing when he says, hey, I'm going to leave for home. But we have to remember that this is kind of a mess that I don't know if he caused it necessarily, maybe, but he definitely wished for it. And if this embassy hadn't come, he would have just left them with the mess that he dropped upon them.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. In both cases, we're talking sort of characters who aren't positioned to see other people's needs and experiences as real as their own until it's too late, right? And so that, again, let's not jump to book 16, 17, and 18, but that's part of the power of how Achilles changes, that Paris doesn't, right? Which is that Achilles eventually, we hear him in his lament for Patroclus saying, I thought Patroclus was going to go home to Phthia to introduce my son to my dad, right? And there you finally get the moment where he's realizing that, where we're realizing that he just thought he was going to die and continue through Patroclus in some way, right? And the loss of Patroclus really drives it home for him, that there are other people who have real lives and existence as real as his, and their loss is immeasurable.
I think it's a little bit of like an almost, I don't want to call him a sociopath, but it is kind of one of those sociopathic qualities of like just that basic lack of empathy for people who aren't you and for desires that aren't yours.
We call it a sociopath. In the ancient world, it's called being a hero.
Yeah, and so there's a fine line between those things, a lot of the time.
Right, and this is one of those things where, there's a great article by a man named Erwin Cook, who teaches at Trinity University in San Antonio. It's called Active and Passive Heroics. And so the title's sort of beside the point, but he starts out by arguing that, look, what people miss out is that heroes suffer and cause suffering. And in the ancient world, there's no virtue, there's no ethics connected to it. They either suffer or cause suffering. And so, what we now see as problematic is sort of a post-Christian reception of heroism. Like, we expect our big figures to be saviors. We expect them to
Yeah, I know that's kind of one of the things that I read about when I was just looking into, like, a lot of the big themes in the Iliad, which is that the Greek hero is not what we understand to be a hero. Its meaning is completely different, and it centers more on great acts. The heroism is in the great acts, whether the acts themselves are actually, great, quote unquote. It's more about the size of the action and the consequences of said action than it is about the character of said actions.
It's like how Zeus is the greatest god, but that just means he's the most powerful. It doesn't mean he's like the best or the nicest or the whatever.
This is actually part of the movement. So if you were to do in succession, both epic, from beginning to end of the Iliad to the end of the Odyssey, the value of the big deed changes, right? So the clearest mark of all, so to jump many books, is the end of the Odyssey. When Odysseus has killed all the suitors' families, they get together and they say, "Oh, he's really done a mega ergon, a big deed," right? And it's very clear at the end that this is not a good thing. That the ability to do something big doesn't qualify you as a good human being and may mean that you should be murdered. So, but I mean, look,
try to keep that in mind when we get there. Many weeks.
Yeah, it's far off. I'll come back for book 24 of the Odyssey if you want. If I haven't frightened you off by then. But look, book 9. So we get to. I think you got to judge speech in the Iliad by what it does, right? And so Odysseus's speech summary takes us back to the beginning of book 9. When Diomedes rallies everyone, he's like, "Screw Agamemnon. If he goes away, I'm going to take Troy on by myself." And everyone's like, "Yeah, Diomedes!" Right? At the end, Odysseus gives a response, right? And there's another moment of silence. So we were talking about silence with Patroclus before. After Odysseus gives his speech, they're all silence again.
And Diomedes is like, "I told you so."
And Diomedes is like, "Yeah, he sucks. He might fight. Come on," right? And they all cheer for him. And so at that moment, I mean, again, Odysseus set Diomedes up, knowingly or not, to re-rally people. And we were just talking about, so was it smart that he did that? They're left in uncertainty. Achilles may or may not leave, right? He's Schrodinger's Achilles at this moment, right? But what we have, but they know what they have to do, which is to fight.
I was gonna say, I feel like it casts some slightly like a clearer path as opposed to uncertainty, because you can't count. Like, he's basically kind of said, you can't really count on Achilles right now. We have to do this ourselves, and we can't just like. I guess that's kind of what happens in the next book, which. And now is as good a time as any, I think, to close out. We could probably talk about this for another hour or 2 hours or whatever. There's so much cool stuff in this book, and we couldn't possibly hope to cover it, despite the meeting of these great minds such as me.
You have such a high opinion of yourself.
It's a farce, okay? I'm insecure. I'm like Agamemnon. I think I suck.
He's just covering it up in bluster.
Yeah, well, let's take a.
We're gonna take a brief break. I think.
Take a very brief break, and then we'll come back to book 10.
Hello, dear listener, and thanks for sticking with us through our little break. We'll be back in just a couple minutes, but I'd like to take a moment during the break to thank a few people and give a little information about the podcast. First, thank you for listening. This podcast has no sponsor. We've produced everything in-house and on our own time, and if you all are enjoying the fruits of our labor, that is the best thanks we can imagine. You can follow us on Twitter at Homer_bound for new episodes, or just watch our podcast page wherever you're listening to us now. I'd like to thank Wriste for inviting me along on this adventure, which has been such great fun. I'd also like to thank the composer and performer of all the music you've heard throughout the episode, who happens to be my dad. Thanks, Dad. You are the absolute best. I'd also like to thank Bubbo for her contributions to the audio, Webs2D for original art of my llama character, Total Love for additional art and graphic design, and Ghosty for graphic design as well. I'd like to thank our many guests for their time and expertise. And finally, an especially big thank you to Dr. Daniel, who closes out each show with additional insights on our discussions. We hope you'll consider reading along with us. We are using the Robert Fagles translation of the Iliad, and while we try to keep things intelligible for those who are new to the story, you might get more out of our discussions if you've read ahead, so feel free to pause and return later once you've read up. We would also like to remind you to stay tuned after Wriste and I have finished, since Dr. Daniel will have some awesome words of wisdom to add to our discussion. All right. Thanks for hanging out through our break. I will give it back to me and Wriste for the second half of this episode of Homeward Bound.
And we're back with Book 10 of the Iliad, Marauding Through the Night. I'm back with Llama. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I know you guys heard we had a little bit of technical difficulties. We got some thunderstorms going on in my area, so let us hope that we have not angered Zeus too much that we can't continue on with this lovely conversation.
Unfortunately, even though we subtly promised to have Dr. Joel for books 9 and 10, the technical difficulties and all the delays and troubles associated with that sort of put him in an awkward spot time-wise. So it is just me and Llama for the rest, but we do thank Dr. Joel for taking the time to show up and give us his scholarly insights.
It was really awesome,
guy.
and oh, he's such a fun guy. What a great little conversation we just had, and so many things that we learned that, like, I loved the part that we got to talk about the duels of the Iliad. That was so cool.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of ultra nerdy, super like deep in the muck sort of thing that you like.
Yeah, I'm absolutely there for it. I'm absolutely there for it, and I know that he kind of teased us with the possibility of maybe coming back for the Odyssey, which I would be super into, but we'll see about that.
People who are listening, of course, will know already because the decision will have been made by the time the episodes are released. But like everything in life, the points don't matter and there's no plan. I don't know. So yeah.
There you go.
So, someone said that somewhere, but we still have plenty of book left to go. Actually, this will probably be a little bit shorter. Book 10 is a weird book for me.
Yeah, and you and I kind of talked about this a little bit, before we started recording this episode, that, like, seems like one of the very few books within the Iliad that feels a little bit or maybe not out of place, but, like, if it were missing from the epic poem, you wouldn't really miss it that much.
Yeah, I was thinking about, like, I was sort of recapping all of our like all the books we've gone through so far in my head. I was like, oh yeah, these are all like great books, and there's something there for they're all like essential, as you said, like this book could. I feel as though this book could be left out, and we wouldn't really notice, as opposed to all the other books, which are all sort of essential reading. They all like sort of build on one another in terms of not just chronological order, but cause and effect.
Yeah, each one of them has at least kind of a nugget of information that is vitally important to the overall
Something that
story.
gives context or motion to what comes after. But again, this one doesn't really seem to. I guess there's like maybe one thing that happens, which to jump really far ahead, Odysseus and Diomedes steal a team of horses from a Thracian king, and I can't remember exactly, but I feel like that team makes another appearance later in the Iliad in a similar way as to how Diomedes is now riding Aeneas's team, which he stole in book 5.
Yeah, there are a lot of these kind of reappearances of things that have happened before. I'm not sure if I remember whether this team actually does make a reappearance, but it sounds like something.
Like it might, maybe in book 23 when they're racing. Maybe that's what I'm remembering.
Could be. That is actually entirely possible during the funeral games.
A horse race, a very long horse race.
Perhaps we'll get back to that again later, and we'll have a little cameo.
Yeah, well,
This team.
we'll keep an eye out. But aside from those horses, which I like horses, they're fun animals, but I don't really care about them as characters too much.
Not especially.
Only one horse talks in the entire Iliad, so you have that to look forward to.
That's a great and like kind of odd statement.
It's
Only
true.
one horse talks. It is extremely true. That's exactly what happens. There is one talking horse, but just tickles my brain a little bit. Only one horse talks.
Now, just because, there aren't like lasting actions or consequences or decisions that are made in book 10 doesn't mean that there isn't anything there. I just think it's, there's a little bit less to discuss when it comes to, as I said, like the overall story. But we do come in off the back of book 9. Or if you can remember all the way back in book 8, it ends at nighttime. Night has fallen. The Trojans are unable to keep fighting because I guess nighttime just stops all fighting. Book 9 took place at night. And here we are at sort of the tail end of night. It's described that, like the first 2 watches of the night are down, but the last one is here for us in book 10.
Marauding through the night. The kind of adventures of Diomedes and Odysseus getting up to no good at all. But as it turns out, of course, they do get up to some good for them and end up stealing this team of horses.
Yeah, well, that's the weird thing, right? So off the back of getting this news that Achilles isn't coming back, Agamemnon can't sleep. He's unable to sleep. He's pacing back and forth. He's like, oh, what should I do? How are we going to salvage this situation? Morning is almost here. And he decides that he's going to do what he's always done, which is pay Nestor a visit and get his good advice. He also runs into Menelaus, who also is having difficulty sleeping. It's a nice brotherly bonding moment where they're sort of one mind at this point, where it's like, yeah, we have to do something ourselves.
Well, it's like nobody can sleep and everybody knows that they're all thinking the same thing.
Well, some people are sleeping. It's mainly these 2 who are awake. Maybe Nestor is awake at this point. I can never remember who's awake and who's not, but...
Well, Nestor is awake because they end up talking to him.
Well, everyone ends up awake. There's a funny moment where Nestor, I think, like, kicks Diomedes and yells at him, and Diomedes is like, oh, you're impossible, dude. Like, come on.
Just like, leave me alone.
Oh, yeah, they're sort of, I guess, to cash in on what we talked about in book 9, where the Achaeans sort of have to figure out what to do for themselves. They can't rely on their big trump card Achilles to come in and win the war for them. They have to do something. It can't be nothing. And so what eventually happens is, all these captains and kings and chieftains or whatever in the camp get woken up, pull out Odysseus, pull out Diomedes, I think they pull out the Cretans. I can't remember if they pull out Ajax or not. But everyone gets assembled. Of course, they get Nestor. And they basically say, okay, we need to see what they're up to. We need to see what the Trojans are up to, so we're going to send some scouts. And in a process, not necessarily a process, but in a scene that feels very familiar, especially off the back of book 7, volunteers are asked for. And as you just said, Llama, we get Diomedes and eventually Odysseus. Diomedes, in his great love of his own courage, stands up and is like, I'll scout out the night. And then Agamemnon sort of allows him to choose an additional companion.
Like, choose your team. Who do you think is the person who should come along with you? Like, who's actually going to be successful here?
We get another little echo of what we've seen Agamemnon always do. There is a little point where after Agamemnon has sort of granted Diomedes that he has a partner, he says, all right, now make sure you don't choose someone based on their rank. Choose the best man for the job, not the most kingly, which is like a dead giveaway, because what he's doing is what he's always been doing, which is keeping his little brother Menelaus out of danger.
Right. Don't, not my little brother.
But it's one of those things where I think Agamemnon thinks it's subtle, but it's really not that subtle, because when he throws in the
I will maintain that Agamemnon is kind of like the bull in a china shop who kind of breaks a bunch of stuff and then kind of looks around and is like, who broke all this stuff?
It's not breaking anything here.
No, not here. Just, it's a general kind of attitude that he has, though. He kind of does all these things, then looks around and is like, oh, who did all this? And then people are like, well, it was kind of you. And I mean that in this situation to say, like, he doesn't really have much subtlety to him. You can pretty much read him, but he's not as good as he's not as good at reading himself.
The fact that he hides it is weird also, because he had no qualms about saying this to Menelaus in book 7, right? When Menelaus puts his foot forward, he's like, no, Hector will destroy you. He's perfectly fine with being vocal about that, but not here. Obviously the situation has changed, but
yeah, and this is a different kind of mission.
I mean, it's a scouting mission. Although I think does the text, I can't remember what the text says. Does it say that he fears for his brother's safety, or is this some kind of other concern?
Well, what it says is he suddenly
feared.
fears for Menelaus. You know, and Diomedes answers back like, what do what are you telling me to do, man?
It's interesting because I don't think that Menelaus was in any danger of being picked by Diomedes. For a sneaky, cunning mission like this, it makes a lot of sense that Diomedes would pick Odysseus. I mean, who wouldn't?
Odysseus, the tactician.
And actually, in any case, it sounds like Diomedes is sort of fanboying over Odysseus. He's like, oh, I couldn't pass up the chance to, work with this guy. Like, that'd be awesome.
And Athena loves him.
Yes, well, I guess that's one thing that we can sort of observe about these two, which is that, and as we mentioned before, Athena loves both of them. So this is kind of like, this is the A team, 100%. These are Athena's favorites, and as Diomedes said, the man could walk through fire unharmed, and I think he may not be too far off the mark.
It's Diomedes kind of goes like, what, do you not want me to take the guy from the club? But he's in the club. Like, he's the good one. But I don't think he understands that Agamemnon is, like, really referring to Menelaus here. Because he immediately picks up on it as being Odysseus.
Yeah, although I don't think he mistakes Agamemnon's intention that he means Odysseus for some reason. Yeah, is that in order to pick my own comrade? Then how could I pass up royal Odysseus here? He that last part that Agamemnon says, where don't bow to a soldier's rank, even if he's more kingly. It's almost like he doesn't hear that. Like, he just hears the first part of what Agamemnon says, which is pick your comrade now, which is where he picks up on. Is that in order? Pick my own comrade. Yeah, he doesn't even hear the rest of it.
Like in gym class, he's ready to pick his team for dodgeball.
Yeah,
you
can see the Odysseus-shaped dollar bill signs in his eyeballs. As soon as
Odysseus is like the rotisserie chicken in the window that he's lustily staring at.
Yeah, I'd imagine. In fact, although it's funny because Odysseus, in fact, I guess this kind of puts this into a little bit of a different perspective. Now that we're talking about it. In book 8, when Diomedes called to Odysseus to help him with Nestor, it's an odd scene because Odysseus is gone, but so is everyone else. He could have called out to anyone, but it seems like Diomedes just really wants to work with Odysseus.
He's got a man crush.
Yeah, maybe
he's got a little bit of a man crush.
There's a bit of a man crush going on, and who wouldn't? Because Odysseus is smart and tactful, and all that, and this is the perfect mission for both of them. And so that's the team. That's the two. They're supposed to go off and scout and learn information or something. And spoiler alert, they really, again, perhaps I'm missing something, and we can keep an eye out for it as we read, but they don't really learn anything. We'll get there pretty soon. this is a pretty short book. It's a fun little book, but it's quite short.
I like to think, like, I know when I was reading this book, I almost kind of had, like, Spy or, like, Mission Impossible music in the back of my head.
The Pink Panther music
they're,
is
like,
going on.
Creeping... yeah, exactly. That's great.
Diomedes and
Yeah,
Odysseus.
and they're just kind of, creeping through the streets. They're looking for people. They're scoping things out. And... they come up on Dolon. Is that how you pronounce that?
It's Dolan or something like that. I don't know.
Dolan.
We sort of, after this scene, we sort of get a sort of mirror version of this scene again, where Hector is also saying something similar to his buddies. He's like, "Hey, we need to scout them out, see if they're itching to leave or if they're gonna fight the next day." And Hector promises to Dolan, this nerd, he promises him Achilles' team, which is crazy.
That is an insane promise.
That's a big one.
Kind of leads me to wonder if it's like actually a serious promise.
He makes it. Yeah. The seriousness. It seems weird to make a promise like that in jest, though, right? Like if Dolan comes back.
Although it kind of hints to that, like, he's not serious, because it does say, "So Hector vowed, with an oath he swore in vain, but it spurred the man to action."
Yeah, well, whether or not he knew it was in vain, I guess is in question.
Wonder how smart Dolan is.
We talked about Hector's, fiery fighting spirit, especially in book 6, where his wife Andromache rightly points out that his fighting spirit, the fiery courage in his heart, will doom them all. And so this is sort of, I guess, a little preview of perhaps how Hector views himself opposite Achilles. Hector thinks, perhaps at this point, especially with like the momentum that they're gaining against the Achaeans, that Achilles isn't really all that much. He ain't hot shit. Like, I'm hot shit. I'm Hector. Like, I can do things like promise his team.
I could totally take this guy.
Yeah, exactly.
I could totally take this guy. Like,
it's been a while since he's seen him though, so maybe he's forgotten. But yeah, this if we are to take Hector seriously, this is just a prelude to what kind of attitude he's taken thus far. We talked about in book 9, Polydamas will give him multiple times good advice, but that good advice usually being, back down, go back to Troy. Hector refuses because Hector is hot-headed.
He feels like the wind is at his back too. He feels like he's getting this push.
And in a way he is.
Like,
the gods are making him
what
stronger.
What could go wrong? And he's not wrong to feel that way at all. Like, in so many ways, as we've just seen in the previous books, the gods are helping him out. Zeus has put his hand on the scale, whether literally or figuratively. The tide has turned.
He's not wrong in the same way that Agamemnon wasn't wrong to sail to Troy based off of this kind of information. It's because we do know that they will take Troy, but it's not going to be how we want it. Agamemnon thinks it's going to be like now, like when we sail on them, we're going to take it now. And so Hector, probably feeling this wind on his back, thinks that this wind is going to push him to victory. And it is pushing him, and he'll gain some victory and some glory, but ultimately it'll end up, again, not going quite how he wanted. And so when he makes this promise to Dolan, it's possible that that's what's going through his head. I don't know. Hector's an interesting guy. There's
He's a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, especially for Polydamas, who, is trying to give him good advice. It's weird because I think we're supposed to see like characters like Priam and even Hector as like, something a little bit more exemplary or better. Like they're above that sort of thing, maybe. Again, I'm getting this conjecture from like Troy, where we have this, wise King Priam in the movie portrayed against a sort of assholey, arrogant Agamemnon. But as we just talked about, it seems like neither of them are terribly good at receiving this kind of wartime advice. They're very adamant about the path forward.
They're pretty set in their views, and they kind of go off of these instincts that they have, which are somewhat guided by the information that they're getting, but are also just like their core feelings of like, I am the absolute shit.
Yeah.
What could go wrong? You know, and it leads both of them into places of, you know, really questionable behavior, but also just
Questionable choices.
questionable outcomes. You know, questionable choices and questionable outcomes. Nothing really kind of goes the way that either of them expected, because they have this one vision of what's going to happen in their heads. And there's some information that suggests that they're right, but there's not nearly enough to be that confident about it.
Yeah, and of course, how are we supposed to, like in the real world, we're supposed to act on our best information, right? Because that's the best we can do. You know, no one has enough time to like be a scientist and a doctor and all these sorts of things. And so we look to the experts. We look to the best information at hand. And we have to go with that because what's the alternative? Like go with nothing and just go with our gut?
Yeah, exactly.
Bad things
You're
go
just
there
trying
as
to
well.
make an educated guess.
I guess it's hard to blame them for making these choices that we, of course, the audience know are going to result in ruination, even though they are just, this is best I can tell, doing what seems best with the information, as you said.
Yeah, although, and this just happens in my head, I could be, you know, cynical here, but like, I start wondering how many times can you do this and have things go so wrong and then continue to trust your instincts on that level?
Well, that's the question, right? Like, how much of this is actually in anyone's control?
Yeah.
There's an example that I keep going to in my head about it's a sort of like story level or fiction level fatalism where you know those annoying parts in movies where two people are hugging or whatever and they've it's like a big action scene, but they see each other on the battlefield or they
run towards each other
and they smooch or
embrace
or something like that, and you're like, just go. But the truth is, regardless of whether they linger on that hug for 60 seconds, for 5 seconds, or if they don't at all, what's going to happen next is going to happen next. If there's if one of them is destined to die in that hug, then if they don't hug, then they'll just die earlier. It doesn't really matter.
Right,
what
they're
that choice
still going
is.
to die. What you do between points A and C doesn't make a difference. There's still the starting point and the destination.
Yeah, and we already know the destination. You know, Zeus has already written the script, and he's just getting ready to shoot the movie. So
yeah, and it's not just in regards to the way that the war is going to end. It's also in regards to, you know, Achilles, what happens to him and stuff like that. Like there are things there's fate that is set in stone.
Yeah, Troy will fall.
And
the Achaeans' ramparts will be dashed to pieces by Poseidon.
And to a large degree, our characters know this too. Achilles knows that he will die young, you know, depending on the choices that he makes, but he also kind of knows what choices he's going to make. Agamemnon has been told that Greece will triumph, that the Achaeans will be the ultimate victors of this great conflict, and that is exactly what comes to pass.
It's interesting that you bring up Achilles, because I'm sure this happens in other parts of Greek literature, but it seems here that Achilles, well, for one thing, he's the only one who's like really explicitly aware of his fate. The Achaeans kind of know. Agamemnon, in book 9, says that, you know, Zeus bowed his head to him and said that one of these days you'll take Troy. And of course, where Odysseus recounted the prophecy from Calchas in book 2 to keep the men steady. But Achilles, not only does he have like an explicit direct line, so direct that it seems like even like, you know, any of Zeus's treachery would not make it through. He also has like kind of a multiple choice prophecy.
It is.
Again, I'm sure that this is something that shows up in Greek stories plenty, but Achilles is the only one who gets this. He's the only one who gets this choice.
And
Hector doesn't.
it is something that he talks about in book 9 about, how I could really like hang up and completely leave and go back to what's the island or wherever it is where he has all of his stuff. I can just go back and live a happy life and grow old. But we all kind of know that that's not what is going to happen here. Unless I choose to do that. I could choose to do that. Just watch. I could choose to do that.
And the weird thing, like, he could choose to do that, but he actually, we already know he won't, both from a meta level and from, like, an interworld level, because Achilles has already basically sealed his fate, because that's what Zeus's plan is. His plan is for Patroclus to die, and that'll bring Achilles out. And yeah, like it's a it's a kind of a heavy question, because can Achilles make this choice, even if he wanted to? Hell, the embassy kills him in a way, right? It kills him and Patroclus.
It does. It seals his fate, because even though it's not the literal point at which he makes that decision, it really is kind of. It's that moment where he knows how things are going to resolve.
What's the point where he doesn't choose to leave? Because if the embassy didn't come, I imagine Achilles would have just gone ahead with his plan to just, go back home.
Yeah. But it
didn't.
It's the point where he draws the line in the sand of, like, I know how this is going to play out. I know the choice in front of me, and this is the choice I'm making.
I would say he's probably still in a little bit of denial. I don't think he knows what choice he's going to make, but he's still leaving that choice open, right, by choosing to stay for an extended period of time. Yeah. And then when he sends Patroclus out, he's like, "Oh, don't go too far. That's another
please don't die."
Yeah. Anyway, we've gotten a bit off track from book 10, but one thing I do want to point out about Dolan, and I have no idea if this is significant, but Dolan is described as putting on a cap made of weasel skin, and I think that just kind of describes Dolan's character. He does seem a little weaselly when he ultimately gets caught on his scouting mission, and lucky for Hector, because he doesn't have to make good on his promise. When Dolan gets caught by Diomedes and Odysseus, he immediately spills the beans. He tells them, like, "Oh, this is where all these people are encamped, and these are who they are, and these are their names, and what else do you want from me?"
Also, please don't kill me. Please, will you not kill me?
Yeah.
They are not receptive to that message.
Yeah, this is the second time that we've seen a Trojan sort of beg for their lives. We got that one time with Menelaus, and he's talked down by Agamemnon. And from what I understand, this was kind of a normal thing. This is, like, because Troy is rich. If you're captured or if you're defeated by an enemy, you can promise a ransom.
Ransom.
Mm-hmm. And
give me the cash.
Yeah, but now we're sort of past that. We're past the whole, I'll trade you this person for that person, especially since if you're on the Achaean side, why would you bargain for what you plan on taking yourself anyway, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also just, a classic, and this is where, tactically speaking, as, Odysseus the tactician, he's not having it at all. There's absolutely no way that he's gonna consider money in any way, shape, or form when it comes against a potential tactical disadvantage to his people.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's very practical when he says, if we let this guy go now, he may cause us trouble later.
Who knows what he's gonna tell them?
Exactly.
Like, not a chance. I'm not gonna let you live. Your life means basically nothing to me. Your information is not all that great, but it's still something.
Well, they do use the information. Not until after, of course, they kill him and steal his lunch money and his hat. It specifically describes him taking his weasel cap.
Lunch money. Oh, the imagery of give me that lunch money. It's mine now.
The image that I have of, I think Odysseus is described as like a little shorter, but he's like really broad. So I have this like You know the meme of like the squash version of a person, or of like,
Yes.
you know, of I think it's usually done with like Keanu Reeves or whatever, like little Keanu Reeves and big Keanu Reeves. Like that's how kind of how
Little stout.
that's kind of how I feel with this duo. You know, Odysseus is like a shorter, broader guy, and Diomedes is like this
kind of
huge dude,
a beefcakey kind of guy.
with wide, thick boys.
He is a wide, thick boy, for sure.
Probably. But yeah,
That's at least my mental image.
but yeah, that's honestly this is kind of where the intrigue. I don't know if it ends, but you know, it plays out kind of as you'd imagine. They use the information from Dolan to infiltrate a Thracian camp. There's a king whose name escapes me. It's like Reyes, something like that. Yeah, Rhesus.
Rhesus.
And he has like, you know, some great horses or whatever. And they go to this camp, and Diomedes kills a bunch of guys, and
As is tradition.
yeah, he kills like a dozen people or something like that, including plus the king. And I believe is it Odysseus who sort of stops to think about what the best action is, and Athena tells him, "Hey, it's time to go. Apollo is not going to let you get away with this if you stick around."
Get back and like make good use of this information, but get out of here before it comes to bite you.
There's a really funny part where, you know, it describes Odysseus taking the horses and lashing them with his bow. Yeah, he's taken the horses, and he doesn't have a whips to drive the team, so he's whacking them with his bow. It's a sort of like
It's a
kind
of comical moment.
yeah, it's like a sort of improvised hodgepodge getaway where like the bank robbers realize that, you know, they've been made, and so they have to like hijack a car, but it's like a pickup truck, and so they have to like use this clunker to get out, or like that. That's just sort of the feeling.
It's a manual. They thought it was an automatic, but it ends up
It's
being
a
a manual, and neither of them how to drive stick shift, which I still haven't learned. And you know, they're both kind of figuring out like, how do we get the car out of here?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's almost exactly what happens. You know, Odysseus is trying to figure out what the best move is. Athena tells him to get out, and he has to whack these horses with his bow to get them on the trail. But yeah, that's what happens. Like, they get out, they retrieve their loot, they come back, and everyone's like, "Yay, they came back!" But there's no debrief. They just like take a bath, and that's it.
There's really not much that happens, and like we kind of said at the beginning of the discussion about this book, like, if this book was missing from the greater story at large, would you really miss it? I'm not sure that I would.
Don't think so. The biggest takeaway that I can get from this book is that this is maybe kind of Athena's book. These are Athena's boys. We know that she loves them both. The book kind of concludes talking about, you know, this great goddess Athena, you know, and rinsing off their skin sleek with an olive oil rub, blah blah blah. They poured their cups forth, honeyed mellow wine to the great goddess Athena, and that's how it ends. You know, it doesn't end on some cliffhanger. It doesn't end on some, and we'll pick this up next time. It's just, that's it.
Yeah, like they pulled off this little mission, and now we're going to basically pray to Athena or make tribute to Athena and see, you know, how much more favor you can curry with her, really.
Yeah, and again, I'll definitely keep an eye out, because I haven't really read through the rest of the Iliad with book 10 in mind. I guess the only thing, what comes to my mind with this book is filler episode. We're all familiar with those. When there's a television show that needs to run for 24 episodes, and, you know, they just put some garbage in there. This isn't garbage, but it is, as I said, kind of out of place. But it doesn't make any sense that they would have a filler episode, because the Iliad is already so long, and I don't think that they worked on the same monetization model as television shows that have 24 seasons, right? Like, Homer isn't doing ad reads, and so he has to like stretch it out. he's just you know, delivering the goods. So I'm kind of confounded.
I feel like there's potentially something that maybe you and I are missing here about the importance to this that maybe, Dr. Dan might have some insight
Yeah, we're not supposed to
into.
directly invoke his expertise.
But I'm doing it.
Shame on you.
I know, I'm terrible. But I am kind of curious because I just know, there's kind of a reason for everything that goes on in these books as far as we've been through so far, and certainly in the books to come. So, like, I just sometimes wonder, like, what is it that I'm missing here that kind of makes this more important that I'm not really seeing? But it just seems to kind of be, like, fun little hijinks along the way that, to maybe almost bring a sense of levity after the embassy.
That's
and
what I was about to say, yeah.
when the fighting gets started, it very well could be that.
Because the embassy is so heavy, and as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be a lot of violence, a lot of fighting, and a lot of war coming up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, maybe this is, maybe the thing that we would miss if this wasn't here was that sort of calm before this enormous storm up ahead, which I can appreciate.
Very
for
well
sure.
could be. I think that is, a really good point and something to kind of look out for. Because also, like, as we get into these super action-packed, meaty books to come, I wonder what other points of levity that there might be. That maybe we might not see them as that, but
Book 14 is a nice little
a little bit,
break.
Yeah. Before the really, really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, as we've talked about before, there are these kind of peaks and valleys in the book that you would imagine that you might need in terms of the oral tradition of, like, telling this story to a live audience. And you need a break.
Maybe this is the book you bring your children to, right?
Could be.
If you want some, like, fun for the whole family, you come listen to the wacky adventures of Odysseus and Diomedes. Storming a Thracian camp and stealing their horses.
Tiptoeing through the streets. What will they get into? Who will they meet?
That rascally Dolan. They'll run into him for sure.
And he's dead.
Maybe not so fun for the kids. There's still a bit of slaughter, but and there's also a nice description of our two heroes sort of hiding amidst the bodies and the blood. So it's a little bit grisly. I don't know.
It is.
But by the rest of the book standards, it's pretty light.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, there's a lot of grisly stuff in all of these. So this one overall seems to me to just have a little more of a kind of fun adventure-y feel to it in terms of, this little mission.
Yeah, you could definitely take this story home to your kids and tell them, like, hey, you want to hear the bedtime story about Odysseus and Diomedes? I don't know. Maybe I don't know if this sort of thing ever served that function. Who knows?
Honestly, I think it very well could have, but I think that's probably a good place to wrap up on Book 10.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thanks for listening. This was Book 9, Book 10. Again, our guest was Dr. Joel Christensen. You'll be able to find his socials and other such relevant links in the whatever description area you happen to be engaging with at the time. We thank him again for his expertise and his time and his willingness to sit down and talk to us for an hour.
Yeah, it was really awesome.
Dr. Daniel will probably not say too much about Book 9 because, as he pointed out in a conversation with me earlier, it already has its expert. Perhaps there's something that he'd like to point out or mention, but I'm sure he has something to say about Book 10. So make sure to stick around for his tag. We'll pass it over to him, and we'll see you after.
Hello everybody, my name is Daniel, otherwise known as Dr. Daniel, Dr. Dan, or the Dancing Grad in my Twitch and Discord circles, and as Wriste just mentioned, I'm going to be passing over comment on Book 9, since I defer to Dr. Christensen on everything he had to say about that book, but I do want to offer some thoughts on Book 10, particularly in response to the questions that Wriste and Llama posed about what on earth this book is actually doing in the context of the Iliad. In classicist circles, Book 10 of the Iliad is often referred to as the Doloneia, or the story about Dolon, and Wriste and Llama are certainly not alone in feeling like this book is sort of the odd duck out in terms of the 24 books of the Iliad. Some classic scholars go even further, to posit that Book 10 does not belong in the Iliad at all, that it's not a genuine part of the work, and even pass over talking about it entirely in works of scholarship on the Iliad because they don't consider it a genuine piece of the work. There are a few different reasons for this, but the primary one is that the content of Book 10 is very problematic in terms of the larger ideas contained within the poem. A night raid, carried out by Odysseus and Diomedes, is not particularly heroic or laudatory. All of the combat that we see in the Iliad is mainly performed during the day, when enemies know that they're fighting against one another. Think, for example, about how Ajax and Hector in Book 7 are dueling, but then stop their duel as night falls in Book 7. War for the Iliadic heroes is about taking a stand on the battlefield, fighting against the enemy face to face, killing them in glorious battle on the battlefield, not sneaking into a camp in the middle of the night to kill people while they're asleep. In particular, there are two actions that are really problematic in terms of what these heroes should be doing, but don't end up doing. First is the double cross of Dolon, and the second is the killing of the king Rhesus in his sleep. First off, the soldier Dolon from the Trojan side is aptly named because the term dolos in ancient Greek means something like trickery or deceit. But we're not talking about Dolon's trickery, but we're talking about Odysseus's trickery here. They get information out of Dolon and promise to keep him safe, but then end up killing him. Going back on your word and breaking a promise like that is very problematic. Then, the murders of the sleeping soldiers of Rhesus's camp, and the murder of Rhesus himself, is not, as the kids would say, very pog. It's a cowardly act that no self-respecting soldier would resort to. They would rather face their enemies on the battlefield in full daylight as the sun flashes off their armor, rather than steal this win by killing people as they sleep. To be honest, I'm sort of on the fence myself as a classicist about the authenticity of the Doloneia and whether it belongs in the Iliad. But if it's genuine, then we have to ask ourselves the question, what is it doing here, and how can we understand it in the context of the larger story? I think the fact that Book 10 follows Book 9 is not an accident, and their collocation, their being placed close to one another, tells us something really interesting about what's going on in the larger arc of the Trojan War. The very fact of the existence of the embassy in Book 9 highlights the fact that things are not going the way that they should in the Trojan War for the Greeks. Achilles, the foremost Greek warrior, is sitting on the sidelines when he should be out there on the battlefield doing what he's supposed to do, fighting the Trojans, killing them, taking their stuff. The failure of the embassy in Book 9 to get Achilles back onto the battlefield seems to highlight the fact that this dysfunction is going to continue on, at least for the next 6 to 8 books. The cowardly actions of Odysseus and Diomedes in Book 10, then, seem to highlight this idea that things are dysfunctional and not as they should be. Greeks are supposed to be out there on the battlefield, fighting their fights fairly in broad daylight. Instead, we get an instance here in Book 10 of cowardly action under the cover of night. I think that the prolonging of the dysfunction of Achilles not being on the battlefield and the cowardly actions of warriors like Odysseus and Diomedes are deliberately placed next to one another to highlight the fact that things are not going the way that they should. Furthermore, trickery, like killing soldiers in their sleep, is what the Greeks have to resort to in the absence of somebody like Achilles that can actually fight their fights fairly. This is just my opinion, though, and I welcome any conversation with any other thoughts as to what this book is actually doing here in the Iliad. I think that about wraps up everything that I wanted to say, so thank you for listening to Homeward Bound, and I'll toss it back now to Wriste and Llama.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel, and thank you once again, dear listener, for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed our discussion as well as Dr. Daniel's wonderfully informative expert opinions. We also hope you'll take the opportunity to continue reading along with us, since there is still plenty to love about these stories. Keep an eye out for future episodes by following us on Twitter at Homer_bound, or wherever you happen to be listening to us right now. We're looking forward to seeing you for the next episode, but until next time, take care and thank you for joining us for this episode of Homer Bound.